Suite 650, Washington, D.C. The zip code is 20001.
Next, the media and the Whitewater investigation. We'll show you a forum held Tuesday by Harper's Magazine. Participants included John Camp of CNN, Brian Duffy of U.S. News and World Report, and Little Rock journalist Gene Lyons, who wrote an article in the current issue of Harper's about the Whitewater investigation. Moderating the discussion, Harper's editor Louis Lapham. The program runs a little more than 2 hours.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much for coming to the conversation this afternoon. It proceeds from an article this month in Harper's Magazine entitled "Fool for Scandal: How the New York Times Got Whitewater Wrong." And the contention of that article, and the contention of the author of that article, Gene Lyons, who is here among the panelists, is that the Whitewater scandal, which embraces many different aspects, financial dealings in Arkansas, as well as confusions in Washington, is based almost entirely on rumor, gossip, hearsay, flat-out fabrication, and that there is no scandal there. It's like hunting the snark. And it starts, and the article is an anatomy of how a scandal is made out of whole cloth. The evidence so far seems to support the argument made by Lyons. In other words, the story begins, as far as I know, in March of 1992 with a piece in the New York Times by a reporter named Jeff Girth. And then, over the course of the next 2 years, it leads to congressional hearings. A great deal of money is spent. A great many column inches of print are expended. There's a lot of time on television. There are 2 congressional hearings. There are 2 independent prosecutors. The presidency is daily said to rise or fall on what will be the next revelation. The conversation gets into not only fraud, bribery, financial chicane, but also into, in its more remote reaches, into possible murder, drug dealing, crooked relations with Indonesian dictators, and so forth. It becomes a very spectacular melodrama, and at the moment, there is still an investigation, or the ball is still in the air in Congress. There is still an independent prosecutor at large and presumably gathering evidence. And what we're going to talk about this afternoon is how such things, how does this come to pass? The Times was invited, but has chosen not to come. Girth was invited. So are his editors and supervisors in Washington. And the way this is going to proceed is that I'm going to start with Gene Lyons, who will speak for about 5 minutes, and then go back and forth among my panelists, each of whom will have 5 minutes to lay out an aspect of this story or non-story that he or she has thought most deeply about. So the statements may not be, at least in the beginning, they will be facets of an argument. And then I will, after those depositions have been taken, statements have been made, then I hope that the panelists will talk among themselves, or contradict one another, or bring up points, or further revisions and amendments. Then the discussion will be open to questions from everybody else in the room, and those questions can be addressed to anybody, to the panelists, myself. And I would really like to see this conversation turn into and entertaining and instructive 2 hours, so I would hope people would speak very bluntly to whomever they choose to speak to. And with that in mind, our first talk will be given by Gene Lyons. Gene?
This back. Thanks, Louis. I might say before I say anything else that I'm very grateful for the trust that Harper's put in me to run this piece to begin with, and the great editing and fact-checking it got, without which I might have made a fool of myself. I may yet. And for their support in putting this press conference on. Now, I don't expect to be greeted with what I'm going to say, or with the article in general, with hosannas of praise and joy for having done this piece. This is a real tough story at this point for the press, because collectively speaking, the press and the media generally, it seems to me, have gone off whooping down a false trail. It may be becoming evident to some of you, at least, that it is a false trail, that there's no scent under our noses any longer, and we've got to turn back and try to find out where we went wrong. I'm certain that some of you will mind me saying so, but if you want to find a scandal in Whitewater as I know it, you might ought to better go back, get up search teams, and hunt Washington for 8-year-old heroin addicts. Now, I'm talking, obviously, making reference to the case of Janet Cook in the Washington Post, who invented an 8-year-old heroin addict, received a Pulitzer Prize for it, was ultimately forced to recant the story and leave journalism. A story that was shocking and horrifying, but not altogether unlikely. In fact, I don't think too many of us would be surprised if we did send out search teams that we couldn't find an 8-year-old heroin addict somewhere in the city. In the case of Jeff Girth in the New York Times, the story wasn't quite invented from whole cloth, which in my view makes it worse, because when you simply invent a fictive character, nobody gets hurt. When you use real characters and make up a fictive story, real people get hurt. There was a Whitewater real estate deal, development, although if you've ever been there, calling it a development at any stage of its, at any incarnation is a vast overstatement. There was a Madison Guarantee savings and loan. There is a Jim McDougal. You can find him now living in a mobile home in the fair town of Arkadelphia on Social Security disability payments since he's disabled and mentally ill. He did run the savings and loan into bankruptcy. There's even a Judge David Hale. This character exists. He's a known figure, although he wasn't appointed by Bill Clinton, as has been reported many times. He was appointed by Clinton's predecessor, the Republican Frank White, and has been reelected every 2 years since then. Therefore, what I would say is that at the start, you had what I've heard referred to as a smoking quid pro quo. You had the governor of Arkansas involved in a real estate deal with a savings and loan operator who later went bankrupt. Good question. Did Clinton do anything to help his pal out when his pal got in trouble? Or did he not? And if so, what did he do? So it's a question to pursue. My contention is simply that the reporting of Jeff Girth is not much better than the reporting of Janet Cook. That what happened was that he got about halfway down the trail to this story, and I'm guessing now, this is not a fact, began to sense that he was running out of story. This all fed to him by Sheffield Nelson, Clinton's 1990 gubernatorial opponent and a legendary dirty political fighter in Arkansas, and by Jim McDougal himself, who was at this point outraged with Clinton for what he perceived as Clinton's abandonment of him since when he went bankrupt and was tried for federal bank fraud charges and went crazy and was eventually found innocent. Clinton didn't know him anymore. So I think what happened was at some point the scent began to run out and the decision was made print it, which made, in the long run, what I think the entire American media and even the international media party to what is essentially a hoax. Not a conspiracy, a hoax. There was no, I've heard the only complaint that's been made to me specifically from the New York Times is that I didn't talk to any editors or senior people at the Times. That is absolutely true. I was not interested in the inside baseball aspect of the story. I'm still not interested in the inside baseball aspect of the story, who edited what, how it got in the paper, whether or not it was fact-checked. My contention is the story couldn't have been fact-checked. The whole story started on March the 8th, 1992, when Jeff Gerth's initial report appeared, which has been praised in the American Journalism Review, as you may know, for containing 80 to 90% of what we now know about Whitewater. I hope that if you've read my article, you get done with some of these handouts, you'll be persuaded that 80, 90% of what you think you know about Whitewater is in fact provably and demonstrably false, based on hard evidence that was simply suppressed or ignored in the writing of the story. At this point, in March the 8th, 1992, it was after the New Hampshire primary, before Super Tuesday, and before the New York primary, which was going to be contested. If a story on Clinton's finances was going to have any impact on the nomination process, it was going to have it. My guess is that most people at the Times figured what most people in the country figured on March the 8th, 1992. He ain't going to get the nomination, and if he gets it, he sure ain't going to win. And so I think it was seen as a nothing little throwaway story. There's nobody much to kick about it. Nobody got time to fight it. And that's that. The press has been scored in some places for not picking up the ball and running with it. It seems to me to have been the proper judgment. What has happened after that, I think, is that the situation got out of hand once Clinton became president. You've got what you might call a feedback loop operative, or what I would call you might also call a self-fulfilling prophecy. We had another word for it in high school, but I'll let you think of that yourselves. Gerth writes a story. Basis of Gerth's story, the RTC in Kansas City, which was given all the information on Jim McDougal and Madison Guarantee back in 1986 and didn't do anything with it because they had billion-dollar failures to deal with and didn't have any serious evidence of wrongdoing, ignored it, dropped the ball. Well, now the RTC picks up the ball and runs with it. Then they leak a story. They leak news back to Jeff Gerth and reporters at the Washington Post and other places. And they begin to call people in the Treasury Department and the White House, and everybody goes into full-scale panic mode, because my guess is the people at the Treasury Department who made such fools of themselves in front of the Senate a while back believed what they read in the New York Times. Most of us normally do. They don't know the details of this story. They don't know if the boss is guilty, is charged, or innocent. They make a bunch of phone calls. What can we do? What can we do? We've got to do something. We can't do anything. Can't we do something? No, I guess we can't. Oh, okay. This now is a full-blown Washington scandal. Boom. The whole thing has gone crazy since then. I don't know how much detail I need to go into at this point. I thought I would start just making a bit of the point, go back to the March 18th, 92 story, look at a couple of key points that I've already written about and that I've more than once, but make those points and then get to discussion. Let me read the headline and the lead sentence from Gerth's original article and tell you what I think is wrong with it, and then go on a little further, and then I'll sit down. Here's the headline. Clintons joined S&L operator in an Ozark real estate venture. Washington, March 7. Bill Clinton and his wife were business partners with the owner of a failing savings and loan association that was subject to state regulation early in his tenure as governor of Arkansas, records show. Okay, what's the problem with this? Well, the problem is the time sequence is crazy. When Bill and Hillary Clinton made their original Whitewater investment in 1978, Jim McDougal wasn't involved in banking. He wasn't involved in savings and loan association. That came 3 and 5 years later. Nor was Clinton governor in 1978. He was Arkansas Attorney General and certainly the leading prohibitive favorite to be governor. A close reader who followed the story into the 20th paragraph or so, as I did, someone asked me on the phone, didn't you get this analysis from somebody? Didn't somebody else make this? I said, I got that analysis when I first read it. I'm reading this thing and I'm going, wait a minute. You follow it into the 20th paragraph, you might recognize that the story and opening paragraph were at best misleading. But determining the actual sequence of events from Gerth's original story is almost impossible. So in part, the murkiness of Whitewater is the murkiness of the writing of the stories, which is confusing at best. Now let me get to what I think to be the classic Whitewater, Jeff Gerth Whitewater sentence, which appeared in that March 8th story. It consists of 3 elements. When I set out trying to break this story down, I had to break this sentence into 3 parts to deal with it, as I've done in this elaborate thing that Harper's has handed you. But let me read this sentence and then deal very briefly with what's wrong with it and then move along. Here's the sentence. It's a perfect, classic sentence. After federal regulators found that Mr. McDougall's savings and loan institution, Madison Guarantee, was insolvent, meaning it faced possible closure by the state, Mr. Clinton appointed a new state securities commissioner who had been a lawyer in a firm that represented the savings and loan. Now, as I say, it's a classic sentence. The first clause, after federal regulators found that McDougall's saving institution was insolvent, is provably false. They did not find that Madison Savings and Loan was insolvent either in 1984 or in 1985 or in 1986. The documents are at hand. They're there in the Arkansas Securities Department for anybody who wanted to look at them. They're there at the Federal Home Loan Bank Board for anybody who wants to look at them. You can call the federal officials that were involved with the case. They will tell you what happened. Nobody at the New York Times evidently talked to the federal officials at the Federal Home Loan Bank Board who were involved in this decision. At least the ones I talked to said they never talked to anybody at the New York Times. Second clause, meaning it faced possible closure by the state. In fact, and in reality, although Arkansas law can be read to say that the state has the duty and responsibility to close down bankrupt savings and loan institutions, in practical fact, the power is purely theoretical for several reasons. The main one of which, 2 big reasons. One is that federal courts had, first, Arkansas law makes no provision for repaying depositors of failed financial institutions. That belongs to FSLIC, the Federal Savings and Loan Insurance Corporation. Unless and until FSLIC and the feds decide that they're going to pay, Arkansas has no way of closing down the S&L and paying the depositors back their money. Therefore, the feds controlled, as you can see in all the documents, the feds control the decisions and the timing from the ground up. What the Arkansas Savings and Loan, what the Arkansas Securities Commissioner would have had to do was file a petition in state court of a rebuttable paper, by the way, alleging that the institution was bankrupt in front of an elected judge. This is an adversary proceeding. Evidence can be given on both sides. Considering that Madison could simply have walked in there with Federal Home Loan Bank Board officials and said, no, you're not insolvent, it wouldn't have done it much good. Second of all, federal courts had already ruled, as Jeff Gerth was informed in writing by the Securities Commissioner, who he said didn't remember anything about the thing, that the 8th Circuit Court in St. Louis had previously ruled that in cases where federal law and state law conflicted and the closure of S&Ls in Arkansas, federal law took precedence. So that in fact, the state's power to close S&Ls, as Gerth was informed in writing by the Securities Commissioner, who he said didn't remember anything, was purely theoretical at best. In fact, they couldn't have closed it down even if it was insolvent, which in 1984 through 1986, it wasn't. And the third clause is maybe the most misleading and in some ways the most unfair because it singled out an individual who actually performed a very difficult job under very difficult circumstances, having a great deal of responsibility and very little power of dealing with the S&L collapse in the state, of which Madison was this big compared to a couple of 500 million collapses we had, under very difficult circumstances, and basically took this woman who cooperated with Girth at every stage of the game, wrote him detailed memos, which I've included for you, and made her basically into a crook and a liar. At which point, unfortunately, she went to ground, refused to talk to reporters at all, and that hasn't helped her a bit. But the insinuation in the piece throughout is that Clinton, faced with a crisis in which his buddy needed help, went out and appointed a hack who would do his bidding. Well, this woman, whose name is Beverly Bassett Schaefer, told Jeff Girth when he called her, told him in writing in great detail, as you would say, Jim McDougal didn't get me my job. I have never met Jim McDougal. I have never spoken to Jim McDougal on the phone. I do not know his wife. I have never heard Bill Clinton mention his name. You might be interested, if you read her memos, you'll see there's no mention of Whitewater in the memos. Why is there no mention of Whitewater in the memos? She says it's because she never heard of Whitewater, and Girth never said anything to her about it. My experience, this is how cops and prosecuting attorneys operate. Reporters, in my experience, and certainly in my own practice, generally tell people what it is they're writing about and what it is they want to know. And generally, if I tell you my wife is left-handed and she says she's right-handed and you've got no way of making a decision which is which, it's journalism 101 that you print both of our accounts. In this case, every error that was made, every omission, every misleading paragraph and clause ran in the self-same prosecutorial direction. This is a hit. In fact, Beverly Bassett Schaefer's appointment to be Commissioner of Securities in Arkansas in January 1985 had absolutely nothing to do with Jim McDougal's problems. The incumbent, whose name is Lee Thalheimer, had resigned from his position to re-enter private practice. He was appointed by the Republican Frank White. He stayed on for 2 years under Clinton and decided to quit to re-enter practice. He told me, I told Girth this. She told me she told Girth this. You have the insinuations in front of you. Well, that's enough. I could beat this thing to death, and probably will before the day's up. What I want to say is that basically, it seems to me, and I would say this in passing too. The same is true for the commodities trading story. You've got Hillary Clinton's commodities trades over here. You've got Tyson Foods and the state government over here. Complex relationship. I don't know any state anywhere in the United States of America where the largest private employer and fastest growing industry would be treated with great hostility by the governor. But you've got a total removal of context. Everything good that happens to Tyson Foods over a period of 6 or 8 years is portrayed as the result of some kind of skullduggery. Every time Clinton and the poultry industry went like this, and you've got to understand that the Speaker of the Arkansas House of Representatives is the chairman of the Poultry Federation, that's omitted. You've got the same kinds of things. You've got the same kind of spin. You've got the same kind of removal of basic facts that alter the whole picture. You've got talking about a lawsuit in which you imply that one person who isn't party to the suit is a defendant. You omit another defendant, and you write the story in such a way as to make it appear that there's a conspiracy where a fair accounting says there's a damn mess. So what we've got now, we're this far down the road, is we've got the entire national press and a good bit of the Republican Party has, metaphorically speaking, set off on a canoe trip down a river. We've gone through 2 whitewater shoals, and somebody has figured out that we forgot the food and we don't have any damn tents. Now, we've got 2 possibilities. We can either drag the canoes back upstream and start all over again, or we can leave the canoes by the side of the river and hike out to civilization. It seems to me what the majority of the press has decided to do instead is to get a burlap sack and a club and go out in the woods to hunt snipe. That's all for now.
Well, that's the beginning, and you have in your press folders, you have a great deal more information. Talk to Gene at great length, and you can go on in very fine detail. But for the moment, we're going to talk to Jeff Birnbaum from the Wall Street Journal, who is, I don't know whether he's on the canoe trip or has a burlap sack or is looking for snipe, but I'd like to know.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I don't have a whole lot to say, and I'm sure that the questions will be more interesting. I cannot comment about the New York Times, basically, because I don't work for them, and it's too bad that they're not here, really, because this sort of makes this whole endeavor sort of empty in a certain way, because that would be a much more interesting conversation. I can say, can try to explain what the Wall Street Journal has done briefly, and on this subject. First, I should explain that I write for the news pages of the Wall Street Journal, and I do not write for the editorial pages. It's probably useful to use this forum or any forum to explain that we are completely separate entities, and we have no contact with them nor them with us, except reading their dispatches, and they're reading ours when they appear. So anything good or ill you might have to say about the Wall Street Journal's editorial page, you should address to them. There is one part of Mr. Lyons' piece that I think is worth pulling out and examining, and that is there might be pressure, he suggests, for news organizations to print articles about subjects to which they devote large resources. Just one small phrase, and I would concur that that is a danger that we should all be aware of, and which I can happily report the Wall Street Journal news pages were aware of, and were very careful to act on. After the point where it was learned that Bernie Nussbaum removed some Whitewater files from the office of Vince Foster, that was surely a curious act, or at least one that we were curious about, and probably for some reason, at least we wanted to know about it. There were several Wall Street Journal reporters who were assigned to the subject. In other words, we devoted considerable resources to the Whitewater issue. The result, I'm happy to report, was that we ran a series of articles over a long period, almost all of which ran at the lower portion of our back page, depending on the story. We had one front page story on the subject, but that was primarily out of Chicago and dealing with the broker of commodities on the Hillary Clinton Blair issue. And so we at least consciously tried to write our stories on this subject based on the facts that our considerable resources gathered, rather than on the considerable resources that we devoted to the subject. We did not make the case of quid pro quo, but rather laid out the facts as we found them. And I think that it is endemic to our business that we do lay out some of these facts, because they are the subject of important, politically sensitive investigations by federal prosecutors dealing with the President of the United States. So much for the defense of the Wall Street Journal, which isn't even an issue here. So with that, I will be quiet.
too regret the absence of the Times, but on the other hand, a great deal of the press, the rest of the country tends to follow the Times' lead in pieces of this sort, and I expect that one or more of our panelists will address that follow-on effect. And I'm not sure whether Trudy Lieberman is going to talk about that side of it or not, but you're next from the Columbia Journalism Review.
I'll talk a little bit about that. When I first came to the Whitewater story, I really had no particular involvement in any of the Whitewater issues other than as a casual reader and television watcher. But the one thing that struck me was that there seemed to be a lot of media attention centering on what appeared to be the personal venality of President Clinton. And what I was very curious about when I was in my reader stage at this point, why was so much attention being given to this at the exclusion of some other issues that I felt merited more attention? At that time, I was asked by CJR to look into what was behind some of the Whitewater coverage, and I began doing that with the Nexus search. And the Nexus search was extremely revealing. The themes that were appearing in the stories that were coming up on Nexus were all of the same. There was a certain sameness to all of the allegations, a certain sameness to the reporting, a certain sameness to the conclusions that would lead one to believe that something was going on here, something was behind all of the sameness that was appearing. There were a number of charges made, accusations, innuendos, suspicions about what the Clintons did and didn't do that were simply plopped down on the pages of these stories without any context, evaluation, analysis, and sometimes with only the most rudimentary explanation of what was really involved in any of these Whitewater tangles. Various facts and tidbits were often thrown down as conclusions that seemed to prove whatever point the writer wanted to make. And I think one good example of this was Hillary Clinton seeking the power of attorney to clean up the Whitewater affair in 1988. The letter was used widely by many in the media to prove that, contrary to the Clintons' assertions, they had been actively involved in the Whitewater development. And the thing that I found very strange about this is perhaps her seeking power of attorney had something to do with the fact she was actually interested in cleaning up the mess, and McDougal at that point was ill and incapable of handling the affairs of the project. Other explanations for why she might have been seeking power of attorney never got into the news columns, and so the cause and effect was just simply made without any other possible explanations given. The inference, of course, to all of this, and I think this is the inference the public could reasonably draw, was that somehow the Clintons were lying about this. That's what one might reasonably assume. I also began to explore the link between the news coverage and the involvement of Floyd Brown's Citizens United and what was appearing in the press. I had visited Citizens United, and one of their personnel, David Bossy, had tried to interest me in writing a story about Lot 7, which was a complicated real estate transaction in which a real estate developer apparently made a lot of money, and somehow the Clintons were supposed to have given him something in return. Several weeks earlier, the Nexus search turned up an LA Times story that had gone into great detail about Lot 7, but the thing that was striking to me is that the vocabulary used in the LA Times piece was very much the same vocabulary that Citizens United used in trying to interest me in the piece. The same words, the same themes, the same types of conclusions, the same documents to look at. Now, if the LA Times, for example, had gotten the story from Citizens United, they didn't tell their readers that. Instead, the story talked about, quote, fundamental allegations by critics, which they didn't name. And they talked about Chris Wade's apparent windfall, which was apparently raising eyebrows among those examining the Whitewater matter. At that point, I began to get suspicious about who these critics were and whose eyebrows were indeed being raised, and somehow how were the Clintons benefiting from all of this. But those kind of phrases peppered much of the coverage of Whitewater that I examined. The charges, the factoids, the conclusions that had been plopped in the stories were often framed in terms of The charges made, critics observed, scandalous odors, questions persist, ethically suspect sweetheart deals. This was the kind of language that was laced through many of the stories. Instead of the organization's spin and political agenda being actually laid out for readers. Again, the implication of all of this, I think, was to somehow imply that the Clintons were involved in some sort of criminal behavior and moral lapses. At least I think that can be the conclusion that many casual observers or readers would draw from a number of these stories. I'd like to talk a little bit about using Floyd Brown as a source and using anybody as a source, because that's something that we all deal with. We deal with all kinds of sources all of the time. That's our stock in trade. And obviously, journalists are free to use any kind of source they want, however unsavory and however virtuous they may possibly be. Certainly, there's nothing wrong with looking at documents, studies, or any other information a source provides. I think what is wrong is not identifying the source of these documents, or even more important sometimes, the political motivations, the agenda, and characters of the sources. I once had an editor very early on in my career who said to me that the longer you are in this business, the more able you will be able to judge how credible a source is and whether or not what that person is saying is actually true, what actually has any meaning. And I was a very young, naive reporter at one point, and I came to her and told her that I found this great stuff, and she said, now, wait a minute, it's really not so great. And I've often remembered her lesson because it's a very valuable one. I think all of us should be remembering all of the time. Frankly, what was going on here, I think, is that much of the time the source of the Whitewater data was not disclosed, and certainly the political agenda of the people giving this information was not disclosed either. And I think there's really nothing wrong with any of us taking any information, say, from a convicted perjurer, but I think that the reader might want to know that the information supplied in a particular story or a television piece might have been supplied by a convicted perjurer, and let the reader or listener make up his or her mind. I think one of the things that might be helpful in terms of judging the credibility of a source can be applied in this Whitewater matter, and that's how much does the source have to gain or lose by what kind of information is being provided. And I sometimes draw the distinction between sources of the Floyd Brown variety and, say, a whistleblower and in the government or in a corporation. In the case of the whistleblower has everything to lose by going public with a particular allegation of wrongdoing. In the case of Citizens United, they had everything to gain because their agenda and their motivations were being spread throughout the press, and I think that's probably what they wanted. Their aim, apparently, was to discredit the President of the United States by attacking his character and somehow implying guilt in various parts of the Whitewater affair. And to a large extent, I think that the press helped spread that message. I think toward the end of the Whitewater frenzy, along about March, the middle of March or so, some of the press did begin to identify Brown as the source of the information. The Wall Street Journal and the Chicago Tribune, for example, and later the New York Times ran stories that drew a connection between Brown and some of the information that was being fed to the press. In addition, some of the news magazines were dropping Brown's name in connection with the Whitewater affair. But I think by this time, Brown's message had been spread and whatever damage had been done. And I can't help thinking that a lot of the coverage of Whitewater has had some bearing in how the public views Clinton, their leader, right now. The polls tell us that they have doubts about him, and his standing, I guess, has decreased. And one can only wonder about how much Whitewater and the coverage has helped contribute to this.
For the benefit of people who might not know, Trudy, who is Citizens United and who is Floyd Brown? I mean, what sort of an organization is it?
Floyd Brown is the head of Citizens United, which is a right-wing grassroots organization that lobbies on behalf of conservative causes and I guess gets their money through fundraising, through conservative interests.
So it's an interested political faction that is providing information.
Yes.
All right. The next person is Stan Crock from Business Week, who's arrived late, so I haven't had any time to talked to him beforehand, and I have no idea which side of the conversation you're going to come at this subject from, but I'm looking forward to it.
My apologies for being late. I actually take the view that in some ways Mr. Lyons was too easy on the New York Times. He complains that the Times stories omitted a lot of important information. In his article, he omitted entirely William Sapphire's coverage of Whitewater. And let me give you an example of the kind of fodder that would have provided for the article. On January 13th, Mr. Sapphire wrote as follows, if you'll indulge me. Vincent Foster must have been worried sick last June about his letter of February 28, 1989 to the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. In this 9-page letter from the Rose Law Firm of Little Rock, Arkansas, probably among the many papers concealed by the Clinton subpoena collusion with justice, Foster made a pitch for the lucrative legal business growing out of the collapse of the Madison S&L. But nowhere in this document, now under active investigation by the FDIC, is there any mention that the Rose Law Firm had represented Madison when it was open. Foster was asking the FDIC to hire the firm, in effect, to sue its previous clients, which strikes me as an egregious conflict of interest. Here's that February 28th letter. It starts out by saying, the Rose Law Firm would appreciate the opportunity to bid upon or otherwise be considered for legal services arising in connection with conservatorships and receiverships of savings and loan associations in the state of Arkansas. It is a general request to be considered for any work that the FDIC has to have done in Arkansas. Nowhere is Madison mentioned specifically, because it was not a request to represent the FDIC in connection with the Madison collapse. Later in the letter is perhaps one of the most quoted sentences in all of Whitewaterdom. As previously indicated, the firm does not represent any savings and loan association in state or federal regulatory matters. I'm sure you have all seen that quotation. You do not have to be an investigative reporter to read the rest of that paragraph, which says, from time to time we have provided specialized services to some savings and loan associations in such areas as employment discrimination, workout of participation loans, and bankruptcy. It goes on and finally says, accordingly, while there may be individual transactions or situations where a conflict of interest could arise, we believe that the firm would not be ethically disqualified from serving as fee counsel as generally discussed herein. Seems to me that is all of the notice that the Rose Law Firm needed to give to the FDIC. That raises the question, or this whole discussion raises the question of how this all could have happened. I'd like to make a couple of points about that. One is, while there is no excuse for getting stories wrong, the White House does have to shoulder part of the blame for putting journalists, and so many journalists, on the trail. The refusal to hand over documents, the refusal to be candid, the constant changing of stories. Some of my colleagues basically were lied to. All of it gets the juices going. Again, it does not excuse getting the story wrong, but it does explain why so many people were on the trail. There is, as Jeff pointed out, and as Gene did in his story, a question of what to do when you have expended substantial resources. The question then is to figure out what story you have. You can write one, and there was a story here, which I'll get back to in a minute. The other thing is another journalistic imperative, to find the smoking gun, to find the quid pro quo, when there may not be one, when there may be instead a more subtle story. The story in Whitewater, it seems to me, was the same story as in the commodities trading story. In both instances, there was no quid pro quo. In both instances, though, a lot is revealed about the character of the Clintons. Investing in raw real estate, investing in commodities futures is speculation, pure and simple. At a time that a lot of people were speculating, and the Clintons subsequently were harshly critical of those who did. What they were hiding was the fact that they were doing the same thing themselves, perfectly legally, But it was, what it revealed was a certain hypocrisy. That is the more subtle story. That was a legitimate story. And it's just too bad that the Times didn't stop at that point.
That's it? All right, thank you, Brian. Well, we got hypocrisy. We got that far. But that's fairly common, at least it is in New York. I mean, that's it would not be worth a headline, I don't think. Certainly not a two-day story. Brian Duffy, perhaps you can take us further into why or what was the story, or how much of this story is real, or what parts of it are worth talking about.
I'll do my best, thank you. I'll start by saying I don't know either Mr. Lyons or Mr. Girth, so I have no particular point of view with regard to either. I would say, though, that I am extremely uncomfortable. Not only do I not enjoy public speaking, I do not enjoy defending other people's work. And to a certain extent, as Jeff pointed out, one cannot do that here. The charges that have been raised in the Harper's article are, for most of you or all of us in the room who are journalists, they don't get any more serious than this. Fabrication, fraud, they're not terms that I am happy either throwing around or defending, particularly, as I say, when we're at a loss to have the Times people here. I would have frankly been much more comfortable had the Harper's piece, rather than single out Mr. Girth and his reporting in the New York Times, singled out me and the U.S. News is reporting on the Whitewater affair, or Jeff or Stan or whoever. I don't see what purpose, frankly, is gained by pointing out and making comments about an individual reporter's work when all of us who endeavored to cover the Whitewater matter were guilty or possibly guilty of some of the same types of things that, that Mr. Lyons raises in his article. That may be a style point, but for me it's a serious one, because I dare say any one of us in this room might have been subjected to the same sort of criticism. For my own purposes, I would have preferred, and I'm not suggesting that the press should be above criticism. If I felt that way, I wouldn't be here. I think that to the extent that there is material or mistakes to criticize in the coverage of Whitewater, and there are, I think such an effort would have been probably better done by my own lights, as I say, rather than single out one news organization and one reporter, than to take a sampling from a broader range of sources. But be that as it may, before we get into the specifics of this, I'd like to see if I can address what I think is a canard in this discussion, which is the idea of selective reporting. Put aside for a moment the allegations of fraud and misrepresentation, with which I disagree, frankly. The idea of selective reporting is itself something of a meaningless term. Just as if in a court of law there is no case that one can point to, or very few in any event, where a prosecutor brings in 100% of the evidence. Simply not possible, humanly not possible. In any story that you all report, or that I report, or any one of the panelists report, I dare say the same odds obtain. That is, that you don't have the opportunity, either because of deadlines or because of inaccessibility of sources, to get 100% of the story. So while, as I say, I reject the allegations of fraud, deliberate misrepresentation in this instance, I think that perhaps a broader area of misunderstanding is in this notion of selective reporting. Without speaking to the merits of the Times reporting on this, I would say that everyone who endeavored to cover Whitewater was hampered by the fact the sources, as Trudy pointed out, were not good sources. They were not A-caliber sources, and they weren't just Floyd Brown. Mr. McDougal's memory was, to put it charitably, faulty. There were a number of other problems. The White House, as Stan Crock pointed out, compounded things by indeed misleading reporters, deliberate or not. Just as I reject the assertion with regard to deliberate misrepresentation on most of the my colleagues I know who've covered this story, I see no basis to charge the White House with deliberate misrepresentation. Fecklessness certainly is a charge that I think can fairly be laid against the White House. They did, as Stan Crock indicated, really fan the fires of this by failing to deliver, by failing to be forthright. But in any event, the problems of accessibility of getting the quote-unquote full story on Whitewater were perhaps greater than they were on many other stories of this type. They were compounded by the fact that the matter at issue had receded some ways back into the dim mists of history. Documents weren't available. So what, you know, on that kind of story, what is selective reporting? I just think that's a subject that's probably worth all of our considering. I honestly think that, speaking as best I can for my colleagues in other media, that while mistakes were made, I believe they were mistakes that were made out of the reporting difficulties on this story. I would point out one other thing with regard to the allegations made by Mr. Lyons. While I respect them, I would say that in some manner they go to a sort of a secondary issue in the Whitewater case, and I think Stan Crock pointed to what he called the more nuanced story. But the main issue in Whitewater was not the regulatory. Well, it was an important issue. It was not the regulatory issue, as it involved Ms. Schaefer. What it really was and what it started with was the natural public policy or press interest or whatever one wants to call it in the allegations of a sweetheart deal involving Mr. and Mrs. Clinton. Was Whitewater a sweetheart deal? I think a fair analysis suggests that it was. The White House itself has indicated that the Clintons put up roughly somewhere on the order of half the investment that Mr. McDougal did. They were not liable for repayment of the principal of the loans, as I understand it. So is that a fair area for public inquiry? Is it a legitimate area for public inquiry? Yes, it is, I feel. With regard to the commodities trading, is that a legitimate area of public inquiry? Well, taking Mr. Lyons' point and crediting it 100% that in a state, in any state, albeit even a small one, as small a one as Arkansas, there's going to be a certain amount of looking out for the main business interest, and if properly done, that's not an issue. However, when the spouse of the governor is involved in a commodities deal or any deal as extraordinary as this one apparently was, generating phenomenal profits in terms of the amounts of the initial capital invested, I too think that's an area of legitimate public inquiry. The only reason I make issue of those 2 points is because I think from this type of exercise an unfortunate inference can be drawn, and that is that the press has no business looking into these areas. I take the point that the press, if it is going to look into these areas, ought to do so fairly and responsibly and as accurately and thoroughly as possible. But I think a most unfortunate inference that could be drawn from this exercise, and that I hope will not be drawn from this exercise, is that the press ought to leave such matters alone. Thank you.
Well, I assure you I will not draw that lesson from this exercise. My concern is that bad investigative journalism or false investigative journalism drives out good investigative journalism, and so you've got a Gresham's law operating. And I also, although I'm going to leave it to Mr. Lyons later to answer it more specifically, but I think there's a great deal of difference between selective facts and actually suppressing evidence or making up information or saying something is true when you know it to be false. I mean, I can understand not using A instead of B, but in order to say that A is B or B is A, it seems to me to a somewhat different procedure. But perhaps Mr. Hamburger can talk to us about the, again, as to how much of this same kind of reporting appeared in other media, other newspapers, because it was not simply the New York Times, I think, that repeated some of these allegations, which were eventually proven to be empty. Thank you.
Well, I concur with you and with my colleagues here that these matters that we're discussing today are certainly appropriate areas for inquiry. The question is how we present the findings of that inquiry and how we decide what it is we're going to inquire about. What strikes me in this discussion and in reading Gene's critique of the Times coverage is not so much what it says about the New York Times or even about Whitewater specifically, but what it says about the norms of journalism, about what we do as Washington reporters every day, and particularly in an election year. I've just finished a review of healthcare coverage, and as I reread Gene's piece, I was struck by how many similarities there are in the norms that we bring and in the practices we bring to examining these public issues. And I think it's time that we question some of our instinctive responses sometimes in the way we go after stories. There's evidence to suggest that we need to question the way we approach these stories. The Times Mirror Center this year, as many of you know, reported that more than 70% of the American public surveyed now rate journalists at a lower level than they do members of Congress, and believe that 70% reported that journalists and journalism is getting in the way of helping the nation understand and solve its problems. Only 21% felt that we are a constructive force, that we're helping people understand what's going on. So what are these norms of journalism that may have led to the scandal approach to the Whitewater coverage and to Hillary Clinton's commodities investments? I think all of us in the room would agree, or many of us would anyway, that those are worthy areas of inquiry, and in fact, understanding those deals are telling and revealing about the first couple, and that it's useful for us to understand them. These are the norms I'd suggest that drove the coverage and drove it in a direction that produced some inaccurate reporting, which Gene has detailed, and I too am sorry that the Times reporters are not here to discuss that. Let me run through these norms that I identified. And these are norms that I think have governed our profession since they're as old as the Broadway play The Front Page, when Hildy Johnson was the main character. And the first rule is don't get scooped. The second is, if you are scooped, don't get left behind by the pack. Eugene McCarthy once likened reporters in Washington to blackbirds on a telephone wire. When one lands, they all land, he said. When one takes off, they all take off. The third on my list is report on conflict. Conflict is more, we consider conflict to be news, and we place it ahead of substance on our list of priorities. Get something new is another of the norms, I think, that sometimes gets in the way of reporting substance. So how did it apply in the case of Whitewater? I think in an election year and when we cover public officials, there are special norms that apply to don't get scooped. If you want to get something new in an election year, you look for problems that a political candidate may have in his or her past. To call such a story a scandal or to justify its presence on page one, we as journalists have to go through have to use some extraordinary pyrotechnics to get it there. You can't just say Bill Clinton had a questionable land deal. You have to show somehow that for example, that the candidate used his public office, his or her public office, for personal gain, that there was a misuse of the public trust. We saw a little example of that in the Troopergate scandal when the LA Times published the allegations of troopers in Arkansas. Until that point, on the president's alleged romantic liaison. Until that point, the mainstream press in this country had been reluctant to approach that story. What allowed the LA Times to get it out front, to sneak it past customs, as I think John Alter called it? It was that the troopers reported that they had had conversations with the president about getting a job. In other words, he used his public office. It seemed to me, if we look back at the Whitewater story, if you go back even to the very first one that appeared during the campaign, that you can see in that case an example of this election year norm taking place. The lead of the March 7th story that Jeff Girth wrote was, Bill Clinton and his wife were business partners with the owners of a failing savings and loan association that was subject to state regulation early in his tenure as governor of Arkansas. That lead and the story and stories that followed suggested that there may have been some use of the powers of governance to benefit this particular S&L and to benefit the president's personal financial interests and those of his friends. The problem with that lead, which did propel the story onto page 1, and I read it and admired the story, and my paper carried it at the time, but that lead had some problems, as Gene detailed. When Bill and Hillary Clinton made their original Whitewater investment in '78, Jim McDougal wasn't involved in the S&L business, nor was Bill Clinton governor. The suggestion that the president or the governor at that time had somehow used the regulatory powers that of the state of Arkansas to benefit this S&L were a critical part of propelling this story onto page 1 and even into the congressional hearing process. Congressman Leach, when he raised this issue, talked again and again about the regulatory powers in Arkansas. A close examination, though, of the regulatory history of this S&L provides no evidence to suggest that the S&L received benefits by Arkansas regulators. In fact, it is a myth to suggest that regulators benefited them. We assigned one of our reporters in our little bureau this spring to to go in and examine the records of Madison Savings and Loan, the Arkansas Securities Department. And what we found was evidence that the institution had been regulated appropriately, that Beverly Bassett Schaefer had in fact, and that her predecessor, who was appointed by Bill Clinton, had in fact showed regulatory diligence in looking at the S&L. And then we called the federal regulator, who, as Gene explained earlier, was the feds were the ones who were primarily responsible for the regulation of this S&L. And we were told Bassett's, the records that we found in Arkansas and Bassett's account of her regulation of this S&L were in fact accurate. Yet at that time, no one, as early as March of '94, had contacted this particular regulator, Walter Falk. The New York Times had gone ahead with its story without ever checking whether the regulation of the S&L in Arkansas was appropriate. I think I've exhausted my time here. I guess I just conclude with the hope that maybe as we examine the coverage of Whitewater, it'll cause us to examine the norms with which we bring to political coverage and coverage of public officials generally.
Thank you, Tom. Before we get to the questions, we're going to hear from Mr. John Camp, who has followed this story for CNN and is a dean among television's correspondents as an investigative journalist. And perhaps, John, you can also talk about how difficult it was to, or is, to try to present the contrary view of Watergate against a prevailing wind of wisdom that still wishes to believe in the presence of a large and terrible scandal.
Certainly, this story in Whitewater is a broad umbrella, and I thought last week in Washington was representative of what I consider to be almost the high satire. Most of you know that the Washington Times ran a front-page story. Trooper recalls Clinton seeking loan help, and it's about a trooper named L.D. Brown. At the same time that this ran, or the day after this ran, the Democrat Gazette ran a story side by side. Arkansas trooper says he saw Clinton pressure judge for money, and then right below that, trooper says, denies story on SBA loan. This is the day after the Washington Times story, and these are side by side. At that same time, the Washington Post was running its story. Arkansas trooper offers partial support to allegation of Whitewater loan. And it's quoting the Washington Times in its story. And then, lo and behold, on Friday, we have the Washington Post running a correction of its story of quoting the Washington Times. And you start beginning to wonder what's happening when you see this kind of reporting in which certainly the Washington Times in its coverage of Whitewater has not been known as a beacon of high-quality journalism, and yet you have the Washington Post and its fear of being scooped coming with its own story and then having to correct that. I was a Johnny-come-lately to Whitewater coverage. I was not a volunteer to go to Little Rock, and I was drafted into it in March of this year because I am senior investigative reporter on the special assignment staff at CNN. And I went to Little Rock with the belief that there was no story there, and and that preconceived notion was not based on the fact that Whitewater was not a story, but was based on the fact that I felt all major bases had been covered by the national media, the New York Times, of course, foremost among the reporting on the issue. And a young producer that I worked with, Matt Saul, had been there for off and on throughout the campaign and had assembled 2 file boxes full of various and sundry documents from the Arkansas Securities Department and from Federal Home Loan Bank. So I spent a good part of 3 days doing nothing but reading those documents and reviewing the documentary information that was available about the rise and the fall of Madison Guaranty. And I emerged after 3 days with a huge dilemma. Was I going to believe the New York Times, or was I going to believe my lying eyes? And my choice was, at this point, to believe my lying eyes, because the documentary evidence did not support basically the premise of the initial story in March of 1992. And I proceeded to try to talk with some of the principals, including Beverly Bassett Schaefer, who had been State Securities Commission, who I believe had been ravaged by the New York Times in the course of this, not only in March of 1992, but unconscionably. In December of 1993, after the Vince Foster suicide, both in the news column, coverage of that, and a justifying editorial that followed, in which an almost direct accusation was made that she had kept Madison open long after it was insolvent as a payoff for Madison raising funds to retire debt for Bill Clinton. As we put together this story and attempts to talk with Beverly Bassett Schaefer, she had been burned by the national media. She had never been interviewed on television and had no intention of being interviewed on television. And I spent 10 hours with her. And the only thing that I promised, and she wouldn't believe, was the fact that we would try to bring some context to the story that we would do. She ultimately agreed to do an interview. Gene's story, which I feel is a very comprehensive and well-done story, omits what I consider to be one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire coverage of Whitewater from day one, and that is the 20-plus pages of a memo written to Jeff Gerth and delivered some 7 to 10 days before the New York Times aired the story. And if you compare that memo with the body of the story that was written, you will discover there was nothing quoted out of that memo. And had that memo been quoted and context been given to the story, I venture to say that it probably would not have made the front page of the New York Times, nor even the national political page, because it basically undercut the entire premise of the story. Had that occurred, then the discovery of Whitewater documents in Vince Foster's office following his suicide would have certainly had no great meaning since they had been sent there by Jim McDougal's attorney, Sam Huer, who had said this on many occasions, for the purpose of cleaning up this company and closing it down in the course of trying to establish a blind trust for the Clintons after he became president. So the seminal story of the Times basically has influenced everything that's come along. The lines such as a sweetheart deal, I disagree that this was a sweetheart deal. The Clinton side, and those documents are available, personal guarantees of a $183,000 loan collateralized by the loan. They also were at risk, and that meant that they were each individually at risk rather than as a couple at risk. In the course of this, they also were at risk on a $20,000 loan that was used as a down payment. So certainly that was not a sweetheart deal. The presumption at the time, and certainly in many land deals that occurred, and I think this is where we lack context, this was an era when many of the World War II veterans were reaching a point of retirement, and there was the belief that there was going to be a great demand for retirement homes and for recreational areas. And many of these land developments were being opened around the country. Most of them were being sold on contract sales, which is arguably unfair to the consumer, since you can foreclose on the property virtually without warning. However, there's an argument that it's the fairest thing to the consumer because he's allowed to buy property that he otherwise couldn't get if he had to rely on a bank. So there was risk involved. There was what was considered to be a logical business plan to retire that debt. My great objection, and certainly I have questions about the New York Times coverage of this throughout, but it's not only the Los Angeles Times. I mean, many of the news organizations that have utilized full-time investigative reporters to go look at this have accepted as gospel much of what was reported not only in the New York Times but in other major newspapers of record. The Los Angeles Times comes to mind. One particular issue is a story that was run in the same month, March of 1992, which basically led with the lead that Clinton had done, had lobbied favorably for an individual who had been convicted of drugs and had earned $750,000 on a bond issue by the state of Arkansas that was made, and he is lobbying on the behalf of the investment banker by the name of Dan Lassiter. Well, number one, it turned out, and the Times, I understand, later corrected this in a later edition, that Clinton was not lobbying on behalf of Dan Lassiter in the bond issue. He was lobbying on behalf of getting the communication system. More importantly, Dan Lassiter was not the lead underwriter in the course of writing this bond issue, but in fact only earned $115,000 as one of three underwriters of the bonds. And this information has continued on as, and Lassiter is, rather than a drug user, has now become a drug dealer. And this has escalated into a drug dealer who made $1 million off of bond issues from the state of Arkansas, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the evolution of these stories. They gain momentum as they're picked up by other news organizations. And my greatest concern and criticism is, why don't these major newspapers do at least some of their own investigative reporting rather than accept the information, whether it be in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, or the Washington Post? I think it's important that we basically go out and do a little of our own research rather than oftentimes relying on the research of other news organizations, no matter how reputable. And certainly I have a great deal of respect for the New York Times and these other newspapers, but they're as fallible, certainly, as any one of us. Thank you.
Well, maybe we can take questions, or people on the panel can ask each other questions, or anybody from the floor can ask a question. As far as I know, we've come now an hour into this, and so far nobody's brought up, at least on the panel, any real evidence for any scandal now or then. Here it is 2 years later, and Congress duly aware and independent prosecutor in office and lawyers at work, but as far as I know, nobody at this table has suggested that there is any evidence of any wrongdoing at all. And that strikes me as remarkable, given the amount of time, space, energy, accusation, suspicion, and allegation that has been carried forward for the last 2 years. And I'm really disappointed that the Times didn't come to answer the questions, because the questions are very well framed. The information is solid. They gave no reason. I mean, they just hung up the telephone in a certain anger. I mean, I didn't talk to them, but the people who called them said that there were several. I'm not sure who the individuals were, but I really find that fairly shocking.
Well, I was on a panel with Steve Lapham not long ago, who has contributed to some of this reporting, and it was Steve Lapham. It was a financial journalists conference here, and it was an investigative reporting panel. I had told him that I would plan to bring up Whitewater as sort of a latter-day Koreagate. I don't know how many people here remember Koreagate. And he said that he would be uncomfortable with that because the Times policy has been that the stories speak for themselves. And that was the defense.
This one doesn't speak very sweetly.
I would take issue with that very general conclusion that there is no evidence of anything here. I think one potential problem may be some campaign checks at a fundraiser. And the people who supposedly signed the checks say they did not do so. There is no politician in Washington who would want Bill Clinton held liable for the veracity of the trail of campaign contributions, though, because they would be cooking their own goose. So I don't think anybody's going to hold Bill Clinton liable for that. But there is that fear. I mean, you say nobody has any proof of anything, but considering the murkiness of the story, the murkiness of the sources, there is a constant fear, if you conclude that there is nothing there, that the next day you're going to pick up the paper and be embarrassed. And we wrote a story in mid-January, and the only publication I know of who wrote a similar story raising questions about the whole thing was the Boston Globe the day before we went to press. And we've been holding our breath ever since. It is very, very difficult to swim against the tide, especially on a story like this. But we pride ourselves in being contrarian. So that's another journalistic imperative that runs counter to the other thing. And we believed it, and we want to be contrarian, and so we wrote that story, and it's held up pretty well since, thank God.
I would say that it's also impossible as a matter of logic to prove a negative. I'm not up here to tell you that Bill Clinton hung the moon or that he's innocent of everything anyone might ever accuse him of. I'm saying take the stuff in this press package and compare it to what you read in the New York Times, and you will see what's happened here. I mean, most of us have I've never passed Journalism 101. I have, however, taught it. I was an English major. When someone writes you a 23-page Dear John memo in great detail explaining exactly what happened, and you write in your story that they didn't remember anything about the affair, it doesn't take a PhD in journalism to understand what's going on there. I mean, I feel a bit like I'm in internal affairs in NYPD Blue. Nobody likes me here. In some sense, all I'm saying is that the stories are full of lies, and it's very difficult to conclude that the lies are accidental. And these stories and the editorials, the indignant editorials in the Times that followed them in December 1993 are what drove this story. If I were going to fault Bill Clinton, I would have said you should have taken a pickup truck, taken every piece of paper pertaining to Marion County, Whitewater, Madison Guarantee, dumped it on the front doorstep of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Associated Press, whoever else, and been done with it. way back in December, but that's not what, I'm not in the business of giving political advice. The fact is that this story is a con job. It's a hoax.
I would like to ask Tom Hamburger about the difficulty of fighting the conventional wisdom, because when CJR looked at all of the papers in the Nexus search, the Minneapolis paper stood out as being one of the very few that gave a much fuller, more questioning explanation of what was going on. And it might be interesting to have Tom discuss why you were doing that and the difficulties involved.
Well, in answering that, I also want to come back to Lewis's comment a moment ago. I don't agree, or I'm not prepared to conclude yet that there's nothing here. It seems to me that the rules in which we should govern ourselves is, first of all, as Gene just suggested, the reporting that we do ought to be accurate. And as John suggested earlier, too, we ought to do some of our own reporting and provide then what we find on interesting topics in context and perspective. So one of the rules we set for ourselves at our paper was this: as the congressional hearings opened and Jim Leach of Iowa was saying there may be evidence of a misuse of office, which in the minds of some commentators brought it to an impeachable offense, we decided we should look into it ourselves and see what the record actually showed. To our astonishment, many other news organizations, and certainly the Times, had not fairly reflected the record. Trudy, it wasn't easy. As Washington reporters, and my colleague Greg Gordon is the one who went painstakingly through the record, we all deal with wire editors on the desk who raise and ask this, and the norms of journalism. The Times didn't report it that way, and it's tough to make the case. What do? You go back to the basic, to the rules of basic reporting, which is review what your sources say, go to the documents, and report it as you see it.
I'm a writer on the Post, and I'm doing a book on I.F. Stone and dissent in American journalism. And I think what you said, if we could just broaden it a little bit more, the whole concept of the norms of journalism, I see things every day in the Post that we would have been shot for 10 years ago. I mean, this concept seems to be sloppy journalism as well as maybe deliberate falsification. But recently there was a story about the SNLs that went contrary to public opinion, and the person writing about this article then quoted people from the regulatory agencies and never went back to the original writer of the story, which was in a magazine, to get a rebuttal or at least her point of view, and it was not accurate what they had said. I don't think that second level is being done, where you go back and say this is what so-and-so said, and it's a biased person saying it and getting the other person able to say that. I wondered if anybody would like to comment along those lines. Also, just simply allowing an unknown, I see it all the time in the campaign coverage today. Ollie North says something, and either the reporters are too young or they don't remember things, and they don't do any historical follow-up to say, however, this is the fact. I'm not indicting Ollie North alone, but I'm just saying that kind of sloppiness seems to be allowed by editors and everybody, and it just adds to this mix that you're talking about.
I think it's the norms of our business that drive that kind of reporting, and you can see an example of it. Gene cited earlier, and others have as well, in the Hillary Clinton commodities trades. Mm-hmm. Lewis, I think that's a terrific story. It's fascinating that how she made this windfall in the commodities market. It tells us about her, and it's worth investigating. But Girth gathered his information on the windfall profits, and then to drive it to the front page, what did he use? He suggested that there was the smoking quid pro quo was that Tyson's had received these benefits. That part of the story he fudged. It wasn't accurate. Tyson didn't receive extraordinary benefits as he described in that piece, but it's what moved the story to page one, isn't it?
Exactly.
Can I suggest a story while we're on the subject? Where'd that $9 million loan come from? That's a follow-up question I did not ask. I regret that I didn't. Where did that evidence come from? People at Tyson, their media reps say nobody at the New York Times called us about the loan. My colleague Ernie Dumas, without whom I could not have written this piece, who's a veteran Arkansas political reporter for the Arkansas Gazette and now a columnist for the Times, asked around in the only conceivable, I mean, he knew right off that it couldn't be true because there's no law in Arkansas that would have permitted the state government to lend that amount of money to a Fortune 500 company. So right off it had to be wrong. He called around to the only possible state agencies, I guess AIDC, Industrial Development Corporation, and the ad for the Development Finance Administration, saying, did the Times contact you on this? Can't find anybody that the Times talked to on this. Where did this damn thing come from, this $9 million figure on the front page of the New York Times? That's a question that I'd like to see answered.
I have one other thing to add about the basically historical amnesia that seems to be a chronic problem. It would have taken one phone call to demolish Jeff Grith's first story. It would have been a phone call to the Resolution Trust Corporation, and you would have asked one question: how many thrifts nationwide were closed down in 1984? Does anybody know the answer to that?
I imagine it's none, isn't it?
Well, you're very close. The answer was 9. How many were shut down in 1985? 9 again. In 1986, 10. It's kind of hard to argue that there was special treatment for this one thrift. You were left with the impression that everything was being shut down all around it, and this one thrift was standing there because of preferential treatment. Why didn't anybody make that phone call to the RTC?
To comment on the fact, I'm a talk radio host, that when talk radio got a hold of this story, many of the listeners in talk radio think that the New York Times is the, the mouthpiece of the Clinton administration and the most liberal publication going. And so by the time talk radio got a hold of it, and here's the New York Times giving this story, it moved into astronomical directions. It also then, of course, became into the Clinton Chronicles and that, if you call that, whatever it is. But I'd like you to comment on what then begins to happen in the other parts of the media when it leaves the written press.
I'm sorry, the last part of your question was?
And then it moved into the Clinton Chronicles, which, I mean, took the story to even new greater heights of dishonesty.
Well, you're talking specifically about the Clinton Chronicles?
Well, no, I'm talking just about how the story moved. The talk radio audience perceives the New York Times as this sort of liberal mouthpiece, often. And so
again, talk radio has been the source of so much misinformation because they have made the quantum leap from the New York Times stories to all of these stories. This particular story, I don't think, has a great deal of appeal to talk radio because it is a complicated story and it deals with real estate transactions and with S&L regulatory matters that don't have a great deal of pizzazz to them. What talk radio has done.
You mean Rush Limbaugh? Is that what you mean?
No, I mean, I'm a host, so I listened to how people took the transactions that were talked about in this story from the New York Times and then made it even greater.
I think it got impetus from the New York Times and from other. Everyone jumped on this story and it expanded into areas that had nothing to do with Whitewater per se. That's why I say it is a grand umbrella that deals with everything now from the Trooper Gate to the issues of drugs being laundered through Little Rock and the Arkansas Development Finance Agency. I mean, it has taken bizarre twist, and they're so strange. You sit and say, how did this happen? I think talk radio took it to heights because you listen to hosts. I'm out of Atlanta, not out of Washington, so you listen to the Atlanta talk show hosts, and you just drive along shaking your head because of the misinformation that's being conveyed.
Yes. Mr. Duffy, you said that you thought that selective reporting was a canard in the whole story, that prosecutors themselves don't even report 100% of the story. Ending your story, your Harper story, you say that, quote, in the post-water everything gate culture, no reporter wishes to appear insignificantly or insufficiently prosecutorial. However, there is a defense, a strong defense of selective prosecution, i.e. I was prosecuted but nobody else was. So is it fair to say that your complaint about the reportage on Whitewater was not that there was too much reporting, but too little selective prosecutorial reporting?
I'm not sure.
Okay. In other words, the New York Times went after the story from one angle very hard, but didn't do it from all angles very hard. So was there not too much reporting, but too little or too much selective prosecutorial reporting?
Yeah, that's my whole point. I think that basically that Jeff Gerth set himself up as a prosecutor. Except if you actually ask a prosecutor in the real world, it's not a prosecutor's job to win convictions. It's a prosecutor's job to obtain justice. And in this case, I mean prosecutorial to simply mean biased. I think that all evidence to the contrary was simply suppressed, and actual lies were written.
I'm sorry. Yes.
I agree with Mr. Lyons. I think the most important decision a prosecutor makes is to decline a case. One declination where justice is served is worth any number of convictions in my book, and I think similarly with reporters. I would, I guess, be at variance with what was just said is that I think, and you stated it yourself in a formulation that I guess I don't agree with, is that the Times went after it from one angle and to the exclusion of other unspecified angles. What I would say is that there are only two basic questions raised by Whitewater, and both are I think, are of legitimate interest and worthy of pursuit. One is, was it a sweetheart deal? By my lights, Whitewater, and I know other panelists disagree, Whitewater was a deal that an ordinary person such as myself, or I dare say most people in the audience, would have been privy to, regardless of the state of the real estate investments and expectations of retiring veterans and all of that. So that's one issue, whether there was a sweetheart deal. The second issue is whether there was a quid pro quo, whether as a public official, Governor Clinton or Attorney General Clinton did something to benefit a regulatory agency or personnel that cut Madison or McDougal or some other, involved party a deal. So I think that both of those issues were worthy of pursuit. Again, without getting into the merits of how this particular news organization pursued it, I think there was some grist. I mean, this was not, something that was invented out of whole cloth. The fact of the matter is, even a news organization with the power and influence of the New York Times does not, regardless of what others think, I disagree, does not have the influence or the clout to result in the appointment of not one but two special prosecutors. Similarly, it does not have the power or the clout to result in RTC criminal referrals. Now, a referral, as most of you know, is only that. It says there may be some violation of criminal law here, and these violations may involve the following people. In one of those referrals, at least, the Clintons were named as possible beneficiaries of possibly illegal action. Is that something that's worthy of pursuit? I can't see how you can answer that question in the negative if you're in this business. So I would just leave it at that.
Just a little disturbed by the personalizing of this against Jeff Gerth. I mean, you said you didn't really want to pursue it deeper into the Times and the fact-checking, the editing and so forth. But if you're really going to level the indictment of this severity against Gerth and the Times, I would think it would be very enlightening to know just how all of that proceeded through the Times.
Well, I hope somebody else writes the story. That's another story.
Well, you're talking about decisions to place stories on page one and so on and so forth. Headlines, for example, Mr. Gerth doesn't write headlines. Somebody else wrote the headline, some editor. And, well, it's not. It's kind of implied that you get a lot into Gerth's motives, at the end of your
I haven't said a word about Gerth's motives. I don't know what they are.
But you imply that this had something to do with the Stevens and so forth, Sheffield, Nelson, and that, I just think maybe in terms of completeness it would be better. And one other thing, just a little bit
there's sort of a subtext that all these stories about Arkansas culture are kind of flawed in the sense that they come out of this prism from Washington, and that Washington itself is a fairly corrupt town, media-wise, every other way wise. And even if that's true, I mean, so what? I mean, the story, if there's corruption in Arkansas, then that you know, that's fine. I mean, what's the problem? I mean, is there an argument that people from Washington shouldn't be in Arkansas kind of poking their nose into all this stuff?
Take the first question first. Jeff Girth's name is on it. I don't know him. I've never met him. He put his name on it. My name's on the piece in Harper's. I've been waiting a month and a half now. Nobody's suggested any of the facts in my article aren't true. If they are, my name is on it. You can come talk to me about it. You can talk to Lewis or the fellow who did most of the line editing of the story, or the fact checkers. We know where to go. If you want to pursue it that far, I would suggest at this point, it's a story. It's a story. I mean, take this handout. Come to Little Rock and dig into the records. Interview the people. Look at the same records we looked at. Try to figure out how a reporter came up with what he came up with, and then ask, how did you do this? Did you not fact check your stories? Was anyone asked about the truth of this? I don't know how it got into the paper. I could never get anything like this into any place I've ever worked for. No, excuse me, I could have gotten it into The Nation or something when I did columns for them years ago, but I couldn't have got this into Texas Monthly or Newsweek or Harper's or any of the other places I worked, because I would have had to prove my case to the fact checkers, and I couldn't have done it.
Gene makes a really important point, because those documents, which were constructed contemporaneously in 1984 and 1985, they basically go against the premise of the New York Times story. There is no, I went through as Gene was talking, and I looked at the printout that I made notes on while I was in Arkansas, and I counted 19 either factual errors or points of contention in the first story. This was done the day after I went through the records that were available to me through the Arkansas Securities Department. Mainly, we had, as I say, 2 file boxes full. This information was easily obtained by anyone, and the records were very clear-cut on how Beverly Bassett Schaefer had handled this, that Madison Guaranty had gotten no favored treatment. You look at the records of the Whitewater transactions, and you see the risk factor that's involved, and this land deal. And we have to also remember that this loan was made even though the Clintons were at risk. Jim McDougall was not a financier. He was a land developer, and it was not uncommon to have the lead operating partner in any land development use his basic reputation to acquire a loan from the bank. And he had known the Clintons for some period of time, and by their admission, he brought them in because of his track record of success.
Can I just jump in?
I'd like to answer. I'd like to bring up a secondary point on this here, and that's what I meant by talking about internal affairs a minute ago. We're all uncomfortable. I'm not uncomfortable about it at all. I'm willing to stand by my stories. I think anybody should be willing to stand by their stories. We're all very uncomfortable because we're saying somebody in our own line of work has done the dirty. Okay? Look, we're talking about a lot of other people's lives and reputations here who have been hurt badly by this. Let me tell you a story that's in the body of this great handout I've given you. You can examine it if you like. Here's a story. When the second wave of stories came, Girth writes a story, the RTC starts an investigation on the basis of his story it had previously declined. Now, here comes the second wave of stories in December 1993. Girth writes a story in which he specifically accuses the Arkansas Securities Commissioner Beverly Bassett Schaefer of a conflict of interest. His story states she had, as a lawyer practicing in a private firm, represented Madison Guaranty, and that when she became commissioner, ethics experts, both locally and nationally, said that she should have stepped down, that she had a conflict of interest, okay? I talked to Girth about that for some time on the phone. He told me that story, that she shouldn't have been dealing with it at all anyway, and we talked about it for quite some time. So, okay, I decided to check it out. Fact is, she never did represent Madison Guarantee, and he was told that, I'm told. Now, what it looks like, what I'm saying here is, why are we feeling sorry for Jeff Girth? You know? Okay. I don't mean to personalize it. I don't know the guy. Right.
I think the more interesting question for the National Press Club is not about Jeff Girth or his competence as a reporter, but about why these stories received such wide currency and why more of us weren't questioning them or doing our own independent research.
Well, I think that many of us were. I mean, how many of us had reporters in Little Rock? Quite a few, I imagine. And, you know, and as to, you know, there being this sort of slavish rush to follow the New York Times, the first Madison story sank like a stone. It was only, I mean, this point has been made and it's not worth dwelling on now, but I think it was the conduct of the White House machinery in terms of its response that sort of generated the immense press hunt that followed. But I would just like to make this point, to go back to an earlier point. I think my understanding of the records with regard to Whitewater, and I only edited our stories on Whitewater, so I don't have firsthand knowledge, is that they are very incomplete, and the term murky has been used, and I would agree with that. I mean, purely with regard to the regulatory issue, Gene Lyons mentioned the Eighth Circuit opinion, with which I am familiar, but there are at least 2 laws on the books, and one fairly recent memo. Both are Arkansas laws. One is an Act 1043, which did require, it's stated on the books, and intent has to be translated as something, and I'm happy just reading the black and white of the text, that you know, a more proactive, immediate, contemporaneous response by Arkansas thrift regulatory people was called for by those 2 laws. That, as I understand it, is not, Gene, addressed in the Eighth Circuit. So I'm not suggesting who's right or wrong here. I don't have the competence to do that. I'm saying that the record is not at all as clear as some people would like to suggest.
It seems that what's going on here is that the Clintons tried to make some money. Neither Clinton nor his wife apparently came from wealthy families, and so they were trying to make money in land, as many people in the 1970s were doing. And Hillary apparently was very clever at dealing in the commodities market. And I think maybe what's changed here, this intense interest in trying to figure out whether they made this money legally or illegally, the same standard was probably not applied to previous presidents, and I think that's the point maybe that Myra was trying to get at. I don't remember any stories dealing with Barbara Bush and what kind of financial involvement she had in trying to make money, or Nancy Reagan, or even Nixon in his dealings with Bibi Rebozo. And it seems to me that looking back through all these presidents, the standard seems to be different here.
I disagree. I think there were stories about how
the standard seems to be different here.
I disagree. I think there were stories about how the kitchen cabinet made Ronald Reagan rich, how he got his ranch in Santa Barbara. And one way of looking at this in an appropriate way is that they were trying to make some money. Another way of looking at it is that some people were trying to take care of them. And it's a very common thing. Probably half of Congress has sugar daddies. You know, they don't make that much money on their salary, given the fact that they have to have 2 homes, whatever. Certainly as governor of Arkansas, Clinton didn't make a lot of money. And at the time, Hillary Clinton was not making a lot of money in the law firm. I'm not suggesting that anything that was done was illegal, although the trading records at Revco are, to be charitable, dubious. They're very different from the trading records at Stevens. And a lot of people forget there was another commodities trading account, and that was a more normal one. There are a lot of losses as well as gains. And the Revco records really smell. But, you know, it's a very common thing, and it is worth writing about it, especially when they are railing against the excesses of the 80s time and again. And we're better than the Republicans, the rapacious Republicans, because we didn't do that kind of stuff.
That's
when
right.
In fact they did.
That's right. And this goes exactly to the point of the murkiness. On the commodities trading alone, the Revco records only had to be held for a period of 7 years. Those trades also occurred at a time when straddles were legal. A question about straddles is, who gets the tax write-off. There are a lot of very wealthy people in Arkansas, some of whom the Clintons numbered as friends, or at least social people they met and knew socially. Those records, I dare say, will be lost to history. So we don't know if the 100,000, or the precise number escaped me, whatever it was entirely by good fortune, or because Mrs. Clinton read the Wall Street Journal, or because of her friendship with the General Counsel of Tyson's Foods, or because those profits were allocated to her accounts and other people who needed tax write-offs had the losses allocated to their accounts. Is that, again, I come back to the same question, is that an issue worthy of press inquiry and press investigation? I can't see how you say no to that question.
I think that we're moving a little bit more to the point that I would have liked to have seen Mr. Lyons' article as the jumping off point of saying why, what happened, and what have we learned, as opposed to the finger pointing. And with all due respect to the discomfort that's been expressed here in criticizing another journalist's work, I find this a little bit self-indulgent. This was not an isolated story. As I said, everyone jumped on this, and anyone else been able to advance the story or nail something else in it, I don't think we'd be sitting here having the same discussion. But Jeff Girth in the New York Times now is becoming the scapegoat for a story that didn't go thought it was going to go. Mike, and also in a reference earlier from the gentleman from the Wall Street Journal talking about sources, these were, whoever it was that made the comment about these were not A sources, and that people have sources, Floyd Brown, for example, has an agenda. We all know that our sources all have some sort of agenda. Some are more open about their agendas than other, and I think that indeed when you're looking at Mr. Brown as a source, indeed his agenda is very open. That brings me to my question, though, of what have we learned from this episode, and how is this affecting coverage at this point? One of the stories that I'm thinking of now getting less attention than it might have because of the Whitewater issue are the allegations, the way that the healthcare task force was conducted and the possible illegal activities Magaziner and the First Lady that are coming out in a lawsuit that's currently making its way through the courts. If you can comment on that.
Aren't you doing something on that,
Tom? I'm not looking at the lawsuit question. I was interested in the way in which the coverage of the healthcare debate reflects in Whitewater. Was your question suggesting that the look for illegality was the search for illegality? I'm wondering if there has been pulling back when we get into these areas that are murky of Whitewater, where there are allegations where it's still fuzzy on coverage of the president and the administration. If that happens, this whole Whitewater has had an effect. And I guess my question is, what have we learned in terms of the coverage?
Well, I think that the tendency is to say, all right, the press has gone too far. It's too nosy. It's too mean, or whatever it is, and let's now be more courtly and more polite. Yeah. I mean, the shoddiness of or not the shoddiness, but the Whitewater investigation, the failure to find the smoking quid pro quo, or the as yet exists and may be discovered tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock, but as of now it doesn't exist. And so, you read the editorial writers, and they're suggesting that the press has gone too far, as you say, and it's time to be. So I do think that investigative journalism drives out good investigative journalism, and I think the loss to the media from this melodrama of the long-term loss from this.
Are we going to end up with a situation where journalists are doing stories on other journalists' stories now as a
we already are there.
Just going to be the next feeding frenzy of checking each other's stories down the line, down the line, down the line.
Well, we're going to have a lot of checking up on each other, but we already are in a position where the networks follow the Times or the Post, and the news weeklies follow the networks and the Times. Round and round in a circle already.
Anybody who reads the New York Times the way I do every day, you got to, if you want to know what's going on. To NPR in the afternoons, which I often do, realizes that the New York Times drives almost the way my computer drives my printer. It's almost that, so. You know, no, I don't want journalists doing stories on journalists doing journalists. I mean, because we'll all well, I can't say that. I was going to quote an old rugby song I used to know, but yeah.
I have three relevant perspectives on this. I once owned a daily newspaper, lost a lot of money at it. I was an elected official in Florida. I got reelected 6 times, and I also major savings and loan. So I can look at all of these things. And the thing that strikes me is the New York Times, a leading news organization, has layers of editors that are supposed to be reporters do. I had a little paper, but I remember that was one of the things. So, and then you see on their editorial page a rather vicious use of the information, which Mr. Lyons pointed out, in editorially, and then Sapphire takes a step further. So it seems to me that a real question is, does a Mr. Girth see that his advancement at the paper is to raise questions that somebody at a higher level would like to do? Here you have a very severe effort to impinge on the presidency of and raise questions about behavior from 10 years before they were in office. And that's pretty serious. I mean, now as a public official, that's pretty serious. And I think that there's another story looked at, which is what could possibly be the motives of the New York Times in perpetuating this kind of inaccuracy and this kind of vicious attack.
Well, that goes to the question of motive, and we don't have the Times with us. I mean, and so I'm sorry we don't, because that's a question that could be asked Howell Raines.
I don't have any. I mean, I know that we're all prone to self-delusion when we're on a story. It's hard for me to imagine a reporter prone to this degree of self-delusion, though. It's just hard to imagine talking to someone for hours and taking 23 pages of memos from them and then writing they didn't remember anything. I cannot imagine convincing myself that was the right thing to do.
Something that strikes me that makes a lot of these Whitewater stories maybe less than real or certainly not so compelling is the lack of good quotations. Now, just in reading the reporting that Bob Woodward has been doing, you know, behind the scenes in the early days of the Clinton White House, I think he's got some great quotations. I mean, a lot of them are vulgar and obscene, but a lot of them, I think, are very revealing. In the Paula Jones story, you know, it was reported that Bill Clinton said that she had the come hither look. And to me, that was something that was very revealing. When it came to Jennifer Flowers, he mentioned that, well, talking about Mario Cuomo as someone that was acted like he was in the mafia. You know, later on, you know, when he says that this is his first choice for the Supreme Court, I mean, that seems to me to be something very revealing. You know, he admitted himself that, you know, well, he said he never slept with her, but that's something that Jennifer Flowers had indicated herself, that, you know, they never spent more than a few hours in the middle of the day together. But to me, do you think, are there some quotations that, you know, that have grabbed us in a way that, you know, can really provide insight? I would like to hear them.
You make a very interesting point, because I think your question suggests why the media and newspapers are becoming more like screenplays. And if people want to know what direction the media is going in, all they have to do is answer your desire for sexy quotes. And in order to meet those desires, believe me, that the Times will make up not only the story or the plot, but they'll begin to make up the dialogue for you in another few years.
Well, I have a suspicion myself that, you know, Bill Clinton, you know, he just doesn't have the passion for real estate or savings and loans that he does for women or politics. I mean, that...
Well, I think it's a danger. I think it's a danger if reporters go at their story just looking for the quotes. I don't know how many times reporters have called me to interview me about something I've written. They say, will you please just give me one quote? And I find that's poor journalism. That doesn't get at any of the issues I may have written about. And I think that's troubling. If you think that's where we ought to be going. Pardon?
Say nothing of anonymous quotes. That's another thing that seems to be slipping in constantly.
Well, the federal officials gambit is one that is used very frequently throughout these things, and I've been unable to determine in my own work who these federal officials are, because they're not the people that were in charge of Madison Guaranty or the Federal Home Loan Bank Board or the FSLIC.
The most amazing thing in this entire story I found, and I think that Tom would agree with me, when I contacted Walter Falk, who was the senior vice president in charge of regulation for Arkansas SNLs in March of 1994, 2 years after the first story, I discovered that I was only the second reporter in the United States ever to call and ask him about this. The other was Greg Gordon of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. And I
got his number from John.
Yes.
I would like to go back to speakers ago. Doesn't the press and don't journalists have a responsibility and a duty to verifiable reporting? Why would you think another body should do that? And if you think journalists should not monitor each other, who should? I think it's ridiculous not to expect journalists to monitor each other. And so if she's suggesting that that is an inappropriate practice, who would she suggest monitor what is published?
I certainly have nothing to add to that. I've got a great story for somebody that wants a Whitewater story. It'd be a great story for the Wall Street Journal. Who is David Hale? Check into David Hale some, the judge who says Bill Clinton made me do it. Just check into his background. I could do it. I could give you a thing here, but...
The Journal did that.
They did?
Yeah, a long time ago. Yeah. In the Arkansas, it was either the Times or the Gazette did a very good piece. He's been in more trouble as a municipal judge than...
He was a character in a book I wrote long before any of this took place, and where he made legal rulings that would have shocked an Ayatollah. And he's got a pile of lawsuits yay high, one from his ex-mistress whom he defrauded.
I think that your question as to who the press is a good one, and people have not yet been able to come. It's a bit like the AMA. I mean, very few the press. It's like getting a doctor to testify against another doctor in a malpractice suit, or a lawyer against another lawyer. So that, and usually some newspapers have what they call ombudsmen, who are supposed to correct the procedures within the paper, but that argument's been going on for 20-odd years and has never been satisfactorily answered. And
Physician, heal thyself, you know.
Go ahead, yes.
Yeah, I'm John Hurley. I wonder if anyone would like to address the issue. Apparently, the Whitewater issue has a lot to do with the new independent prosecutor. There were 3 complaints filed against him, and Trudy was mentioning that Floyd Brown was involved in some of that original Whitewater thing. Well, according to the story in the Washington Post, Floyd Brown and United Citizens United was also involved in the selection of Judge Santel, and 2 other complaints were also addressed that issue. So perhaps we could discuss that a bit. Excuse me.
I make a political observation that as an observer, the passivity of the Democrats in allowing the Santel thing to go through without banging gongs and waving flags and screaming bloody murder has just amazed me. I just don't know what they could possibly be thinking about, because, you know...
It's a good way to be able to undermine the credibility of Starr at the end, if he should issue some indictments.
Yes.
Gene, I'm assuming that you know, except I mentioned a while ago, that because the level of corruption in Washington is so great that Washington reporters have no business looking into Arkansas, but how much of the opposite is true? Do you encounter people who are members of the press who think that they bought into the notion that the morality or the moral standards of any small rural southern state is so inherently inferior to those of a cosmopolitan urbane New York or Washington that anything that comes out of it must automatically be suspicious?
Well, as Ernie Dumas pointed out first, he did a column one time in the Arkansas Times counting the use of the term incestuous, which of course is, in Arkansas we have Perry County jokes. The definition of a Perry County virgin is a 9-year-old girl who can outrun her brother. You know, but I mean, the whole nation uses Arkansas sometimes the way we use Perry County. And so it's, people there are real sensitive about it, yeah. I was raised in New Jersey. I've lived all my adult life in Arkansas, though, and compared to New Jersey, Arkansas is Switzerland. But no, I mean, come on in and do the stories.
My question, though, is how much reporting do you think is driven by that automatic assumption that...
Well, this is a thing anybody from Arkansas can talk about for a long time, but I've had a lot of conversations with reporters in the last couple of years, and as soon as you start saying, well, that's sort of not the way it is, or that's not the way it was, or you need to talk to so-and-so, you get the feeling all of a sudden the conversation turns patronizing, like, oh, you're a Clinton whore. You know, well, what do? Shovel up my collected works and say, here, find all the praise of Clinton in that pile, you know, which you won't find. I've talked to, this is a funny story, for what it's worth. I've talked to a lot of reporters. The only reporters that I've talked to that really seemed to get a great sense of where they were and to listen to the local people were the people from the Australian Broadcasting Company, who came down to do a story and were there for about 8 or 9 days. And one of the things they'd been told, they swore to us, and I said, no, get out of here. The people aren't telling you this. They said, we were told by people at, and I won't name the papers because I've been making it up, I don't remember which ones they were, but at major newspapers, they were assured that if they stayed at the Capitol Hotel in downtown Little Rock, that since this was owned by the Stevens interests, which of course have been fighting Bill Clinton since the year 1, but that's not the way it's reported up outside the state. But if they stayed in a hotel owned by Stevens interests, that all their telephone calls would be monitored and that they would be followed everywhere they went. That Arkansas had a secret police. That Bill Clinton, every sparrow that fell, Bill Clinton knew about it. I asked this fellow whose name was Tony Jones after he'd been here for quite a while, and he kept talking about how much Arkansas was like New South Wales. And, well, you've been here 8 days now. What do you think of this idea that Bill Clinton can organize a secret police that can spy on all these reporters and collect all this information without anybody knowing it? And he said, well, it's like what we say in New South Wales, couldn't organize a piss-up in a brewery. I mean, you've seen in The Spectator what we have for state troopers guarding the governor. What in the world makes you see what, I mean, for that matter, you've seen what they have at the CIA. What in the world would make anybody believe this? But yeah, I think there's a certain amount of patronizing stuff that's driven by the media. I have had the experience of living in New England with an Arkansas wife in the early 70s who was treated like a combination of Eva Brown and Daisy Mae Yoakum some of the time, and got terribly lonely, and we just decided to come back south where people laughed at stuff. I'm sorry to you New Englanders, but we like to laugh a lot in Arkansas.
Gene, and you can't overlook the all-time great editorial in the Wall Street Journal about L.J. Davis being knocked over the head because he was investigating the Rose Law Firm.
Right. L.J. Davis, who was knocked over the head by 8 double martinis.
This was in the course. Exactly.
Those were the New Republic.
Yes, right. They fed him those martinis, held him down and fed him those.
One more question, if there is one more question. Otherwise, yes, go ahead.
Can you speak to the allegations by L.D. Brown?
No, I don't know much about him. Ernie, can you add anything about L.D. Brown? This is the state trooper who apparently he's changed his story half a dozen times, is all I know.
Why do you think the Clintons were so reluctant to hand over the Whitewater documents? What do you think? Just your own opinion. Why do you think?
Well, I wrote a column basically saying when it's all over, they're going to blame Hillary, and it's probably right. But, you know, I really think that if, and this, see, now I'm going to do this, and I'm not a friend of theirs. We're not personal friends. I've never been, well, I have been to their house, but it was a formal occasion. but I mean the governor's mansion. They've never been to mine. We're not friends. But I think what happened was basically Hillary's father died last spring. Vince Foster killed himself next, and within 48 hours on national radio. This is not a woman who has a great deal of love or respect for the press, incidentally, as a personal matter. Within 48 hours, they're saying, Rush Limbaugh is saying that she had Vince Foster murdered. Then in December, well, her husband's mother is lying mortally ill with something that would kill her less than a month later. 2 days before Christmas comes the infamous Trooper scandal. In the middle of the Trooper scandal, everybody says, give us every piece of paper you've got all the way back to your Girl Scout cookie records, and we will determine whether or not you are innocent, whether or not you are morally worthy. And I think at that point, they just got their backs up and said, basically, not if they tie me to a log and throw me in the Potomac River in a blizzard. They are not getting them. I think it was a terrible mistake, but that's how I would explain it. And see, there I am. It's a small town.
If you've ever had to go back through your own records and look up for tax receipts and all this sort of thing, you'd have some empathy for them when the reporters said, well, they keep doling things out a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. Well, maybe they're just finding them a little bit at a time.
But if reporters can't be excused for getting things wrong, should they be excused for giving us misleading information, incorrect information?
I'm saying it's not necessarily misleading. It's coming out a piece at a time because they're only able to find it.
There was some stuff that was downright wrong. We were the recipients of some of that information.
I'm sorry, I promised one gentleman over there a question if you want.
To get back to something Mr. Duffy said, I think it's quite right that one of the central questions is whether Whitewater was a sweetheart deal. You said it was, and yet anyone who goes down there to Little Rock is able to get the bank documents that the Clinton signed. So I wonder, what is a sweetheart deal? I mean, if they were liable, if they were on the hook for a $183,000 loan, how was it a sweetheart deal? I mean, what was sweetheart about it?
Well, there were 50-50 partners in a deal that the sum of which exceeded twice $183,000. So that's the deal. It's not a deal that I could get anywhere. So that's true. They were on the hook for the 183 plus the extra 20 that was for the down payment. The sum of the Whitewater investment was greater than that.
The assumption is that they were 50-50. They would get 50% of any profits, when in terms of the tax benefits, the only thing that came out of that, it was prorated. They got only to the extent that they had made contributions. So how can you infer that they would have gotten a different proportion had there been a profit?
We still end up, however, at the end of the day with a story that belongs probably on the financial page rather than on the front page. And I thank you all for coming. I certainly enjoyed what everybody had to say, and I appreciate it.
How are you? See you first.
This event on the Whitewater investigation and the news media was held Tuesday by Harper's Magazine. The discussion was based on an article in October issue, which dealt with how the New York Times covered Whitewater. This Saturday evening at 6 Eastern, we'll show you a speech made Monday at the National Press Club by White House Chief of